Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Cold War Military Heritage Series. This is the Taiwan World Heritage Potential Site Matsu Battlefield Cultural Landscape and the cooperation with National Taipei University, Taiwan. Today we have a distinguished guest, Mr. Chad Manske. He is the retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General, the 30th Commandant of National War College. Today he will give a speech on the topic, Guardians of Memory, the Matsu Island and the Legacy of Cold War Military Heritage Conservation. Chad, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. And on behalf of the Cold War Museum, it is an honor and tribute to you and your university for reaching out to the Cold War Museum to help participate across the oceans in allowing us to share what is my personal opinion, not a reflection of the Cold War Museum, but as a researcher and a historian and retired Air Force officer here in the United States, to share this perspective on how the Matsu Islands were a critical piece in the Cold War history between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. So I will launch right in and get started. The Matsu Archipelago, an array of 36 islands in the Taiwan Strait, occupied a precarious boundary zone throughout the Cold War, where the ideological and military confrontation between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China was both visible and immediate. With mainland China a mere 10 miles away, the islands functioned as Taiwan's forward defense and the first line of resistance against communist invasion following the Kuomintang's retreat in 1949. During the 1950s, Matsu was profoundly shaped by the First and Second Taiwan Strait crises, 1954 to 1955 and 1958, episodes that etched its name into Cold War geography. The bombardments launched by the PRC reinforced the island's militarization, transforming its topography into a fortress of tunnels, bunkers, and gun positions. Yet Matsu's story is not one of perpetual war, but of evolution, an example of how former military zones can transform into sites of remembrance, heritage conservation, and cultural renewal for future generations. The Matsu Islands gained their military importance from geography. Situated at the narrowest point of the Taiwan Strait, they commanded the sea lanes leading into the Min River estuary and the Chinese port city of Fuzhou. During the 1950s and 1960s, their location made them a critical sensor post and deterrent line against potential PLA amphibious advances. For the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, Matsu symbolized the persistence of the recover the mainland policy, an ideological beacon even more than a logistical foothold. The military buildup that followed was astonishing in scale. Vast underground networks, command tunnels, and defensive emplacements were carved from granite cliffs, providing both resilience and concealment. American involvement further heightened Matsu's visibility. The U.S. 7th Fleet patrolled nearby waters starting in 1950, and the presence of American military advisors underscored the island's role in East Asia's wider Cold War deterrence architecture. The deployment of AIM-9 Sidewinders to nationalist F-86 fighters during Operation Black Magic gave the ROC Air Force an advantage over communist MiGs in Matsu's skies, highlighting how innovation and ideology intertwined in those turbulent years. For nearly half a century, from 1949 to 1992, the Matsu Islands were governed under martial law as the Matsu Military Administration Committee, an arrangement that profoundly shaped local identity. Civilian movement was restricted, and virtually every aspect of daily life was securitized. The population lived in the shadow of barracks and batteries, and cultural life fused with the rhythms of military presence. Villagers became accustomed to air raid drills, propaganda loudspeakers, and the near nightly illumination of searchlights scanning the dark sea toward Fujian. This period gave birth to a powerful cultural memory among residents, one of endurance and vigilance, yet also of pride for their status as guardians of the Republic's front lines. That lived experience today forms a cornerstone of Matsu's intangible heritage. Matsu's significance today cannot be separated from its built environment. The landscape itself is a palimpsest of defense, a record inscribed in concrete, steel, and granite. The islands contain several categories of military facilities: defensive strongholds, underground tunnels, barracks, watchtowers, and civil infrastructure adapted for military use. The Iron Fort, Taibao, stands as one of the most famous examples of Matsu's fortifications, a rocky outcrop hollowed into a subterranean stronghold armored in concrete and glass fragments to deter infiltration. Project Beihai, launched in 1968, produced immense tunnel ports, such as Nanyang's Beihai Tunnel, large enough to accommodate flotillas of small boats and equipped for sustaining siege operations. At its height, Matsu's network of subterranean defense installations was among the densest in the world, a testament to the resourcefulness and determination of its garrisoned soldiers. These structures, initially built for war, now act as the primary vessels of memory for peace. Their aesthetic, camouflage-painted facades, granite mouths opening onto dark tunnels, evokes both the anxiety and ingenuity of the era. Beyond their material form, the Matsu Islands symbolized a psychological border. As the Cold War divided East Asia, Matsu embodied the ideological front between communism and democracy. From their shores, nationalist loudspeakers broadcast propaganda across the water toward mainline villages, while communist counterparts answered in kind. This sound war represented the surreal confrontation of two worlds separated by barely visible waves. Internationally, Matsu occupied a totemic place in Cold War rhetoric. During crises, the world's attention briefly converged on these outposts, fearing they might trigger a broader US-China conflict. Thus, the islands became not merely military emplacements, but symbols of global tension. For Taiwan, however, they were also marks of perseverance, a tangible defense of sovereignty, illustrating the idea that even the smallest territories could carry immense strategic and emotional weight. With the lifting of military control in 1994, Matsu faced a profound identity transformation. Economic hardship followed by the military drawdown, barracks emptied and government payrolls shrank. Yet this vacuum sparked a reimagining of how the islands could evolve from a restricted frontier to a living cultural landscape. The establishment of the Matsu National Scenic Area in 1999 formalized this shift, marking the beginning of deliberate heritage conservation. Many fortifications were stabilized, partially restored, and opened to visitors. The Beihai Tunnel and Iron Fort became focal points of historical tourism. Local communities, once subservient to security policy, began to reinterpret their history in partnership with conservationists and cultural planners. Matsu's Cold War past, once heavy with fear, was recast as a foundation for educational tourism and local pride. Effective heritage conservation in Matsu required more than preservation. It demanded interpretation. The transformation of bunkers into museums and tunnels into symbolic passageways illustrated the shift from secrecy to storytelling. Institutions like the Matsu Folk Culture Museum now integrate military and civilian narratives, reflecting how daily life intertwined with defense during the martial law era. The museum's Battlefield Island exhibit reconstructs the dual existence of Matsu's people as both citizens and caretakers of a garrisoned landscape. Meanwhile, the Matsu Battlefield Culture Museum at Shangli Fort showcases artifacts, uniforms, and oral histories that illuminate the human dimension of fortification life. Collectively, these efforts establish a network of historical interpretation that transforms individual sites into a cohesive narrative of endurance and adaptation. The global conversion on Cold War heritage cannot be understated. Matsu today engages in a broader international discourse on how societies confront and repurpose the relics of militarized landscapes. Its approach combines preservation with adaptive reuse, positioning itself alongside other iconic Cold War sites such as Panmunjom or the Berlin Wall. However, Matsu offers a singular model. Its Cold War artifacts are not located in one metropolis or demilitarized zone, but scattered across an archipelago of rugged topography and tight-knit villages. This dispersed heritage demands inventive strategies to maintain authenticity while fostering accessibility. Projects that fuse heritage preservation with contemporary art installations or public architecture programs have reimagined bunkers as cultural laboratories, places where memory coexists with creativity. This demonstrates that Cold War heritage need not be static memorialization, but it can also be a platform for innovation and dialogue. While physical conservation highlights the tangible, Matsu's true treasure may reside in the intangible stories of its people. Veterans who once manned Matsu's watch posts and farmers whose fields were mined now participate in oral history initiatives that record their experiences for future generations. These voices capture the endurance of a society that lived for decades under blackout conditions, rationing, and constant readiness. They testify to the resilience that enabled an isolated archipelago to survive both geopolitical siege and economic marginalization. Moreover, younger generations on Matsu, many of whom grew up after demilitarization, are reclaiming that history to build a sense of collective identity. Community-led museums, heritage festivals, and artistic reinterpretations ensure that the Cold War experience remains relevant, transforming trauma into shared cultural legacy. Heritage specialists emphasize that places like Matsu must balance conservation with renewal. The challenge lies in avoiding museumification, turning dynamic landscapes into frozen exhibits, and instead allowing meaning to evolve. Recent architectural projects in Matsu exemplify this principle. Designers have worked to integrate Cold War-era bunkers into new public functions, cafes, creative spaces, and exhibition halls, without erasing their original character. This spatial translation, as Taiwanese scholars term it, helps connect generations by embedding history in everyday experience. Through these transformations, Matsu demonstrates how wartime infrastructure can be reinterpreted not as remnants of hostility, but as frameworks for peace, participation, and creativity. Preserving Cold War sites in Matsu carries a moral dimension. By sustaining visible reminders of past confrontation, these islands act as memorials that warn against renewed conflict. The transformation of command bunkers into cultural spaces symbolizes society's power to rewrite narratives of division into lessons of reconciliation. The Taiwanese government's 2009 proposal to include Matsu's military cultural landscape as a UNESCO World Heritage candidate underscores this vision. The nomination frames Matsu not only as a record of Taiwan's defense history, but as a peace memorial heritage dedicated to the idea that the memory of vigilance can coexist with the practice of peace. This duality, the coexistence of scar and sustainability, is what gives Matsu's heritage its global relevance. Its bunkers are not glorifications of war, but testaments to human adaptation, engineering ingenuity, and collective endurance. For heritage conservation to succeed, awareness and education must take root. Matsu's museums and scenic sites increasingly target younger Taiwanese audiences, encouraging experiential learning about the Cold War beyond the mainland-centric lens. Visitors walking through tunnel complexes like Beihai and Iron Fort encounter immersive history that fosters understanding of Taiwan's defense legacy in visceral terms. Educational tours organized by the Matsu National Scenic Area Administration provide workshops linking historical preservation with environmental conservation, emphasizing how military infrastructure coexists with coastal ecosystems. These interdisciplinary programs model how historical memory can support sustainable tourism and civic education simultaneously. By linking heritage to pedagogy, Matsu transforms from a niche historical destination into a living classroom for peace, heritage stewardship, and community resilience. The pivot toward heritage conservation also revitalized Matsu's economy. With declining military employment in the 1990s, tourism became the archipelago's primary growth sector. The promotion of battlefield tourism brought new visitors, while government investment in infrastructure increased accessibility from Taiwan's main island. This economic adaptation aligns with global trends where former military zones, such as Normandy's beaches or Okinawa's bunkers, transition into cultural and ecological destinations. The Lianjiang County government's Matsu is a Museum initiative aims to knit cultural institutions, museums, and villages into an integrated experiential network. Through this effort, heritage conservation becomes more than preservation. It becomes a vector for sustainable development. Authentic cultural engagement attracts tourism without sacrificing the integrity of local life, ensuring that remembrance fuels renewal. While progress has been extensive, preserving the Cold War heritage of Matsu brings challenges. Environmental degradation, limited funding, and the decay of concrete structures exposed to salt air threaten many fortifications. Furthermore, balancing access with authenticity remains delicate. Over-commercialization risks trivializing history, while over-restriction limits education. Heritage managers must also navigate sensitivity surrounding the island's still active military presence, preserving secrecy where necessary while maintaining transparency in interpretation. Yet, such tensions themselves echo Matsu's identity as a crossroads between openness and defense. Coordinated conservation frameworks, linking local government, military authorities, and international scholars, offer promising approaches to address these contradictions. As geopolitical competition intensifies once again across the Taiwan Strait, Matsu's heritage takes on renewed significance. The same fortifications that once faced artillery fire now stand as silent warnings of the human cost of confrontation. Their conservation speaks not only to historical reflection, but also to contemporary diplomacy and cross-strait understanding. Preserving Matsu's Cold War memory thus becomes a form of cultural deterrence. It reminds future generations of the fragility of peace and the endurance required to maintain it. Each bunker and tunnel tells a universal story of vigilance and restraint, resonating well beyond the strait's waters. Globally, sites like Matsu help redefine the meaning of military heritage in the 21st century. They reveal that fortifications and arsenals can evolve into socially productive landscapes, places where architecture of defense becomes an architecture of memory and identity. In Matsu's case, the transition has been both physical and moral. Decades of isolation hardened its surface, but deepened its cultural core. Today's conservation projects signify neither nostalgia nor disarmament alone. They embody continuity, the idea that heritage preservation acknowledges struggle without perpetuating fear. In this way, Matsu joins a growing global family of Cold War heritage sites that collectively testify to a century's turbulence and humanity's aspiration toward peace. In the end, the Matsu Islands remind us that heritage is as much about meaning as it is about material. Granite tunnels and gun turrets endure not merely because they are built to last, but because they carry stories worth retelling. The Matsu of today stands transformed, no longer a fortress of isolation, but a frontier of remembrance, where history breathes through the echoes of soldiers' footsteps and the hum of visiting scholars and travelers. Its restored strongholds invite reflection on courage, restraint, and reconciliation. To truly conserve Matsu's Cold War heritage is to safeguard a living dialogue between past and present. It is to ensure that the lessons forged in its tunnels remain audible across the churning waters of the strait and beyond them into a world still haunted by division, yet still yearning for peace. Thank you. I will now take your questions and comments.
Thank you, General Chad. I think you give a very big picture of the Matsu and a very detailed information about the history and the situation now. And you give some strategies point of view on the conservation and the further way. So it's very good speech about the Matsu, and I think our government officer will very thankful for your introduction on the Matsu. So now I have 3 questions, and some are from your speech, but some are the real problem we face about the Cold War heritage. So first question is from the war scholar point of view and from your experience, what is the potential? I think you already mentioned in the potential part in your speech, and the problem of the Cold War military heritage to the general public understanding. In my point of view, sometimes people are not very familiar or very try to they don't want to try to understand this kind of heritage. So from the point of view, what's the potential and the problem of this military heritage, especially for the Cold War era?
Thank you for that question. In my humble opinion, I really didn't know a whole lot about the Matsu Islands' role in Cold War history. And in my research and trying to tie it with my experience and my intellectual curiosity, I find that what the Taiwanese government and the country has done, both the academic community, the geology and architectural community have done, is a brilliant play on strategy. What do I mean by that? In conserving and creating a living, evolving museum with the Matsu Islands Conservation Project, they have created a very neutral and peaceful living museum that I personally believe will be a protected site for the Republic of China, for Taiwan to act as a peaceful barrier between the tension that exists between the mainland and the island of Taiwan. Furthermore, I think that in general, as tensions evolve and the potential for conflict arises, locations like the Matsu Islands as a living and potentially UNESCO World Heritage Site would be protected from any conflict or military incursion in the future, as governments are often loath to take on such historical artifacts. So I think it's not only on one hand is it a great strategy to remind visitors and the world of the legacy that these islands held, but for the Taiwan government itself, as I said, it acts as a peaceful, neutral buffer to the China mainland. Did that answer?
Yeah, I think you already answered my second question because my second question is as a memory of peace, as you mentioned for the Matsu, during this very tension time between Republic of China and the people of the Republic of China. And what is the suggestion for the further narrative and the promotion strategies? But I think you already answered this question because that's sometimes in our conservation project it will be a very difficult part to point out what is the main narrative story about this, because we have the history, we have this site, and we know we want to do some memory of peace storytelling, but sometimes it's not very focused or not easy to focus and not easy to some very deep of this idea. So can you give me a more suggestion about what is the memory of peace and what we should focus on this topic?
Absolutely. I'll further elaborate on some of the comments that I made. Much like our education of the U.S. perspective of the Cold War and our involvement here in the United States in that approximately 45-year period, we find that generations of youth today don't really understand not only the generic term Cold War, but the capitalized, what the Cold War actually was and what it represented, because the term itself represents an abstract concept. When you say war, that has a connotation of active fighting. But when we describe Cold War, this is mainly about deterrence postures and arms races. What are arms? What is a race? What is an arms race? In describing that to a generation of young people growing up today who, although they may understand in the U.S. context what U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, looked like, which was a shooting hot war, what does a Cold War look like in context? And how was it pivotal in history? And how did it lay foundations for future peace and détente? And so in the Matsu Islands case, I believe that everything that the conservation project represents from everyone involved, including the government, the key to sustaining it in the future, as is our experience here in the U.S., is to continue to educate, continue to engender tourism while balancing that military piece, because it will take a sustained effort and money also to keep up the sites, to employ either the paid staff or volunteers to do guided tourism of these areas. So without financial backing and support, perhaps in the United States, we would call it a foundation that subsidizes and supports that effort, the Cold War history could be lost forever. You know, if there is a gap in generational education, that education could be lost, and the oral histories that you have already gathered may not have the meaning that they do now to current generations who are still hearing it and abiding by that history. So it will take a sustained tourism effort, and it will require financial backing, which I think is essential to keep not only the history preserved, but to keep the deterrent effect of the archipelago enhanced for future generations?
Yeah, I think very important, very interesting. You already answered my third question. What's the conservation strategy of the Cold War heritage in US? And as you say, it's education and interpretation for this area's history, and remind how it affect us, and what will happen in the future. And so that's the common issues in the Cold War heritage, because as we already recorded some different scholars and some colleagues about this issue, everybody say the interpretation and the education is important things. And I can share our research and our investigation about the local residents. We also see that only 1/3 of the young generation can understand what's the meaning of this military heritage, and the other 2/3 are very confused and even neglected about this kind of heritage. So we also start this kind of education program to the young generation to recall their understanding. But maybe the last question is how the young generation will understand this kind of history. They cannot understand. It's so abstract and have no influence to them, because they are now the generation of iPad and iPhone, and they didn't have the experience on this kind of the war. And even maybe in US, I think it's more obviously, but in Mazu they also will have no idea what's the tension, what's the difference, or why important. But if we speak too much about the importance, then they will say that's not important to me. So in your opinion or in your experience, how to educate or how to interpret it to the young generation, they didn't have experience or have no idea about the Cold War?
So this is the eternal question that you ask, that quite honestly defies good answers. We have tried, we are still trying to determine how best to educate on the importance and significance of the Cold War for future generations. So I think it will be a perpetual challenge. I think with the Matsu Islands, you have a challenge different than other Cold War heritage sites and exhibits, so to speak, on the Cold War, and that is vast geography. Because the islands are over miles and miles of ocean, if you bring people in to tour them, do they tour one island and get a picture? Do they have to tour 2 or 3 of the islands and get a fuller picture? Or do they honestly have to tour the entire archipelago to get the complete and full picture of the meaning of what the islands represent? Whereas a museum, a single site, can at least focus all of the history and the artifacts and the personal effects and the storyboards and oral histories all in one building over one roof. The challenge with the Matsu Islands educational project is the vast tyranny of geography. So making sure that the villagers who reside in these sites all are speaking from the same sheet of music in regards to a consistent messaging on, when a tourist comes, that they're all speaking the same messaging that the government or the conservancy wants to impart when they come and tour it. Also, We also have trouble fundraising for our presentations in Cold War historical educational series sometimes, again, because people know what a hot war is, but they don't understand what a Cold War is. And so back to your question is an eternal challenge. Conveying that is difficult. It's sometimes hard to describe it to someone who only can understand what a hot war means.
Thank you, Mr. Chad. I think your speech and the discussion will inspire us to how to educate and how to interpret it in the future. And very thank you for your speech today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chun Sui. I will send my remarks to you, and you can use those as you see fit. And it was a privilege and honor to have you ask the Cold War Museum, and it was an honor for me to do this research and share this discussion with you today.
Thank you very much.